And if you don't know anything about the MITRE ATT&CK framework, then today you're going to learn all about it. For those of you that do know, the MITRE ATT&CK framework is normally used for threat intel, but it can also be a starting point for use case development, which can help manage detection and response capabilities of your organization. To tell us all about that is the man to the left of me. It's Bruno Blumenthal, who is Managing Security Consultant and member of the board at Temet. Without further ado, please let's give us a round of applause for Bruno.
Thank you, Catherine, for the introduction. So first I have to say, I'll probably not be able to tell you everything about MITRE ATT&CK because we only have half an hour and it's only a part of my talk, but I will dive into it later on. What I want to talk today about is Agile use case development with MITRE ATT&CK, MITRE ATT&CK as part of an Agile process in use case development. And I hope I will bring all the content in the next 30 minutes I plan to. So as Catherine said, my name is Bruno Blumenthal, and I'll like to start with the content now. So when I talk about use case development, what do I mean? Use case development in the sense of detection use case development is for me the process of identifying undesirable behavior and unwanted activities in your systems, establishing indicators to spot them, and then implement the necessary technologies and tools to detect them and react based on those detections. So the whole process from identifying what is the things you want to detect to the point where you're able to react on those detections. So if you have a security operations center and you like to have use cases to improve your detection, you, in the beginning, first usually struggle with the challenge of finding use cases. So which are the use cases I need to look at? Which are the use cases I want to detect? So then what do you do if you have a problem? You start Googling and you maybe Googling use case framework or use case detections. And you will find a plethora of information in the internet and usually huge lists of potential use cases. Or maybe you have a managed security service provider who provides you with 100 or 150 ready-made use cases for your environment. And then you have the problem that you have too many use cases. So after not having any use cases, now we have 100 use cases and you don't know how to implement that because usually you don't have enough resources to implement all those use cases at once. So you struggle with the problem of how do we now implement those use cases in an efficient and effective way. Then maybe you have missing technologies. You cannot implement all the use cases because you lack of the visibility in your environment. You don't have the necessary locks, the necessary sensors on your system. And so you still have a lot of challenges to address. And then, if that is not enough challenges, we also have a changing world. The world is changing. It's changing rapidly in cybersecurity. We all know that. And the threat landscape changes. New techniques, new attack vectors come up. And you have to face them and you have to adapt your use cases to those new challenges, to those new threats. Or your environment has changed. I mean, we all know that the business is faster and faster and they start a transformation into the cloud, and you need to adapt your security operation and your detection capabilities to those new cloud environments, but you're still not even finished with the stuff you had to do on-prem, so new challenges arises from that. So the target is also constantly changing or expanding in most cases. And then, last but not least, oftentimes the use cases are also risen by an audit or by a vulnerability scan. You figure out you have like problems in certain areas, and the mitigation mechanism from risk management is, well, we cannot fix the vulnerability and we cannot prevent this attack, or at least not in a short time. So we need to improve our detection capability. So at least we will detect an attack even if you cannot prevent it. So there is another input, another change in your priorities, another change in your environment. So in the end, if you're talking about use case management, use case development, it's a lot about prioritization. Which are the most important use cases? Which one do I need to implement first? Which one do I need to implement with the highest priority? And on the other side, it's about adaptation, because your environment changes fast, so you need to be adaptable. So in the end, it's about being agile. And I know agile is a bit of a buzzword, and it has sometimes a bad reputation because a lot of companies try to be agile and fail. But I think that the cores and the ideas behind agile, in the sense as it has been proposed in the software development world, are actually very good principles, methods, and processes which you can also use in use case development to address those challenges of the changing environment and of the questions about prioritizing our use cases. So when I first started thinking about how we can improve and become more agile in the space of use case development, I thought, well, let's look where they started in software development. And agile is not something new in software development, even though it has gained attention in the last couple of years. It's actually a concept that is much older. And one of the turning points in this of this idea was the Agile Manifesto. The Agile Manifesto is a document which contains about 4 value statements and 12 principles, which was written and published in 2001. So it's over 20 years old, but I think it still holds true in most regards. And it was written by a group of software developers who had similar problems as I described before, similar challenges. They were coming from the software development perspective and were thinking about how can we provide the most business value for our customer, and how can we adapt on the changing environment and the changing requirements of our companies, of our business, of our customers. So they sat together and looked at what are the problems with the software development processes back then, and how can we improve them. And they came up with certain values and principles. And I looked into those and thought about how can we actually use those principles and ideas also in use case development. What I came up for this talk, which is a bit shortened version of the Agile Manifesto, I called it the use case development version, with again 4 value statements and 5 principles, which are derived directly from those principles proposed in the Agile Manifesto, but adapted to the problem of use case development. So the value statements in the Agile Manifesto are always in the form of we value something more over the other. And it's very important to understand that this does not mean that we only do the left-hand side and we don't do the right-hand side. It just says if you have to prioritize in a certain situation, we focus on the left-hand side and not on the right-hand side. So they said, and that's something which I took literally or one-to-one from the Agile Manifesto, they said we value more individuals and interactions over processes and tools. And I think that is a very, very interesting statement, especially if I look at the agile software development projects in companies at our customers, because I think most of them fail because they don't really adhere to this principle, because they focus more on processes and methods and they forget about individuals and the interaction. With everything we do, even though also the processes and on methods I will propose, we should always think that individuals and interaction between individuals is always very important to get better results. The second statement is we value more working detections over comprehensive documentation. Here I adapted the notion of working software to working detection, but it's also something that is in the original Agile Manifesto. And I also think that's very important, also something I have seen a lot at customers. They have extensive documentation. They have their lists of 100 use cases, sometimes with extensive documentation descriptions, what they plan to do. But they don't have so many actually working, implemented detections in their systems. If you ask them which detections are really working, it's oftentimes a lot less than what was documented. So working detection should be always the priority. And the third one is a very special one for the use case development process and has nothing to do with software development. But for me, it's one of the important things as well, which you say we value more many detections over a perfect detection. Because I also see oftentimes that companies are struggling with certain detections and they put a lot of effort in this one single detection to make it work. And in the meantime, they have no other detections implemented because of the resource constraints we all face. And so I say it's better to have many detections that are working than the one which would in theory be the perfect detection, because if it's just in theory and just on paper, it's not effective and it does not really get value. And it's also better to have many detections in many different places in your environment, because the chance that an attacker gets detected that way is higher than if you have a detection only in one place. And the last point is responding to change or following a plan. So this agility is also very important. So the 5 principles for an agile use case development process for me is the highest priority should always be to address real threats. So we should focus on what are the real threats through early and continuous delivery of effective detection. So early and continuous delivery, a very important concept in agile development, which also should be at the core of a use case development process, is that you constantly get better because the environment changes and you need to adapt to this changing environment. To do that, we should have a mindset of welcoming the changes in the threat landscape, to be able to really embrace this threat landscape, these changes, and then have agile processes so that our organization has an advantage over the adversary, because we are able to implement new detections for new attack techniques before they are used against us. And the next one is delivery working detections. Again, this working detections is an important point, and we should then deliver them frequently. That's also from adapted from the Agile Manifesto. They stated from a couple of weeks to a couple of months with preferences to shorter timescale. So early and often is also a very important thing, so that you don't spend half a year in trying to implement one detection, because in the meantime you're blind. So you should have a focus on having detections working. And in the end, that's also our primary measurement for progress and for quality of our security operation, is actually the number of working detections. If we have a lot of processes and a lot of documentation but no working detections, the value of our security operation is low. And the last one, which I took out of the Agile Manifesto, is the one which states continuous attention to technical excellence and good design enhances agility. That's also something which should be part of the DNA when we are doing detection engineering and when we're doing creating new detection use cases. We should always think about how we can keep them flexible, always have in mind we might have to change it. It's not something that is static. So if you have anything static in it, I mean, I've seen that, you probably have seen that as well, like Splunk queries where there are actually hard-coded IP addresses in there and stuff like that. That's not technical excellence. That's something that will bite you later on. That is something that will really hinder your agility in that regard. So those are those principles from the Agile Manifesto and how I think they can be really used as a mindset, and that's very important. It's about the mindset when you go into this process. It's the same if you go into an Agile software development process. It's more about the mindset than about the tools. But nonetheless, when you're talking about this problem, you should also look into what kind of methods and tools and processes and ideas do they have in the software development world, and how can we adapt or should we adapt them when we're talking about developing new detection use cases. So what are the main parts, the main things, ingredients of a detection use case of a agile process? So you work with a backlog. The backlog is a very important thing in every agile methodology, and the backlog is very important. The backlog is not a stack and it's not a FIFO queue. It's more like a pile of things you plan to do, you need to do, you want to do. It's a pile of things, and it's a pile because every time you look at this backlog, you should re-evaluate the priorities of the stuff in this backlog. You should always re-evaluate, is still this task be it an implementation of a new use case or the improvement of an existing use case. Is this the most important task at hand at the moment, or has something changed and some of the other use cases are now more important? And to do that, you should work on a cadence. So that's something most people know from software development, agile software development. You have like this strict cadence. It's like a 2-week sprints or 10 weeks program increments or whatever you call them. It's a cadence. And this cadence helps you to have this point in time which is fixed, where you re-evaluate your priorities and where you can then actually become agile because you can change the direction of your work. And to do that, you also need to focus on digestible portions. So if you think about doing something, it should be in a digestible portion. It should be something that you can do inside this cadence, which is very important as well to stay agile. Because if you have too big portions, you cannot change the course. And if you aren't able to change the course, or if you change the course and abort, a task you already started, you will never end anything. So you need to have digestible portions. And this will help you, and this is also one of the important outcomes of this process, to have detection capabilities updated frequently. So you're adaptable. This can happen, this should happen at least on your cadence, but of course it can also happen more frequently. If you're having an update, you can put it out and you don't have to wait for the next like 2 weeks or 4 weeks or whatever sprint you're planning. And then it's very important to test and evaluate value of the use cases you have implemented, so that you know if it's relevant to put more focus in those as well. So those are the tools that we know from agile software development, which can be adapted and should be adapted if you want to be agile in use case development as well. So my talk was called Agile Use Case Development with MITRE ATT&CK, and I haven't talked about MITRE ATT&CK until now, so I'll dive into MITRE ATT&CK now. So when we're talking about this agile processes, one thing I mentioned many times was this prioritization thing, and I would like to look at the MITRE ATT&CK framework from this perspective and how it can help us prioritize the use cases and be agile based on those prioritizations. So most of you hopefully know MITRE ATT&CK. Does anybody haven't heard of MITRE ATT&CK? Nobody? So great. Most people know that this of MITRE ATT&CK. MITRE ATT&CK, the matrix for enterprise in this case. There are other matrices, but doesn't matter. And it's very important to understand this matrix. It's based on tactics, which are the columns, and then all the cells are techniques. So tactics are intermediate goals an attacker has, and this will be important later on. And it's similar to the cyber kill chain. We all know, probably know, that it is like a flow from left to right. So with initial access on the left, and then impact and exfiltration on the right. And all the intermediate goals and steps an attacker will have to do. Of course, in reality, it's not step by step from left to right. There are loops, there are hops in there, but it's in general the flow of an attack is from left to right in this matrix. But the matrix itself is just one part of MITRE ATT&CK. It started with that, and it consists in the current version of 14 tactics, so 14 columns, and 191 techniques with 385 sub-techniques. So we have like 576 techniques documented in there, so it's a wealth of information. But to those techniques, we have other information that can be handy in prioritizing our use cases. So we have, for example, 133 threat actor groups they have categorized, and they have linked to the techniques. So in the data of the MITRE framework, you find information about which group of those 133 uses which technique in their attacks. So this can be helpful as well. You also have 680 malware versions or software in there. You have 43 mitigations and 39 data sources. Mitigations of how can we prevent this an attacker to use this technique, and a data source, how can we detect it. So this sounds a lot like, well, if you have these techniques the attacker uses, that's something I wanna prevent, and I have these data sources, so this probably can help me with finding some use cases I wanna implement. Yes, it can, but it's not so straightforward because oftentimes it's very high level, this link between data source and technique, and techniques are also sometimes very broad. But I don't have time to go into that detail today. But let's assume we have our use case framework and we have a list of use cases identified. And now the question is, how can we use MITRE ATT&CK to then prioritize those use cases? So first of all, what we need, and we assume we have that done at this point, is that every use case should be mapped to the MITRE ATT&CK techniques. And this does not have to be a one-to-one mapping, so a use case can address a technique in partial address it, because it's so broad that we cannot address every usage of this technique, but certain usages of this technique. It can address multiple techniques because we can detect them in the same process. Or it is really a one-to-one mapping. So there are different ways of mapping those. But let's assume we have our use cases and we have the technique mapped to those use cases. What we then do to prioritize our use cases, we filter and rank those techniques. That's a step you can do once. Then we assess the inherent value of our use case, consider the time criticality, and then we will be able to score them and have a priority for our use cases based on the information of MITRE ATT&CK on certain other information. So to filter and rank, the first step is easy, and you probably have to do it only once. First, you can filter the applicability of the technique, because MITRE gives you the information on which platforms that this technique is used. So if you don't have any Linux servers, you can remove all the techniques that are only applicable for Linux servers, for example. Then you can also remove preventable techniques, because some techniques should be prevented and not just detected. The information about mitigations can help you there. You can look at the mitigations, figure out which mitigations do you have implemented, and then figure out which techniques might be prevented by that, and you don't have to prioritize in the detection. And then the last point you can use is the number of groups that are using this technique. So you can simply count how many groups are using which technique, which gives you an indicator about how relevant this technique might be, because the more groups this technique uses, we would assume that it's more important to detect those, because you will detect more groups, more actors. You can also filter the groups in this step and look at which groups are more relevant for us than others. For example, are they actually active in Switzerland or in the areas my company is operating? Or are they sector focused, and are they relevant for my sector? So this is information you can use as well. This is not always black and white, and it's not a full mechanical calculatable process. You have to put in some brain power, but at least it gives you some directions in this process. Then you would want to assess the value of your use case, and to assess the value of the use case, you would then use this ranked techniques and use this as an indicator how important this use case is, because if it addresses a highly ranked technique, then the use case itself should have more value. What you also can look at is the tactic which is addressed by those use cases, and you would look at the position from left to right, and you would give a higher value to use cases that detect techniques that are used in tactics early in the kill chain process, or early in the from left to right, because you would of course rather have a detection on the initial access than on the exfiltration, because then you can react. You have more time to react on the initial access before actual impact is here for your company. So you would focus on techniques that are more to the left rather than techniques that are more to the right, which does not mean that you should only implement techniques, of course, for initial access and none for exfiltration, but it gives you a way to prioritize them. And the last point I would look at for assessing the value is the coverage of your environment. So is this technique something that is applicable for all my servers or all my clients, or is it just for one system out of hundreds of systems? So the coverage that you have with this technique will also be something that you put into a calculation of the value. And also the exposure of the systems where it is applicable. For example, if you have a technique that or a use case that focuses on your clients or on system in your DMC, this should have a higher value than use cases that are focused on core systems behind several layers of firewalls. Because again, here we think about the attacker is coming in, he will have an initial access on an exposed system, then move laterally, and you probably want to detect him early on and not when he already has your crown jewels in the inner sanctum. And then you also should consider time criticality. Time criticality is also important to consider. So you would look at, is this a use case that is actually addressing a known vulnerability? This makes it more important. You can look at, do we have currently a specific threat intel about this technique or about a threat actor using this technique, a running campaign against our sector or in general, or do we have relevant incidents with our peers which can be important or interesting for us, or other indicators that suggest that this technique is something you really should look at in your detection capability. Well, and if you have all this considered, we now know how valuable our use case is based on technique and some other indicators. We would now, and that's also something I took from ideas from the software development world, we also look at the complexity of the implementation of this use case. And that's something people often underestimate, and then they look at the value of the use case and think, well, this is the most important thing, but it's very hard to detect that, and it takes a very long to implement this use case. And then we have this problem I described before, that we're working on months and months on implementing this probably perfect detection, and in the meantime we don't improve our overall detection capability. We have like a status quo in this time. So you would look at the complexity. For example, do I have that's pretty straightforward, I need the data sources. Again, we can look at MITRE ATT&CK for help. Do I need specific tooling? Do I really have this technique or this log information already? Do I need some sensors to produce it? And then a very important thing also is the distinguishability of this use case, or actually the technique which is addressed by this use case. Because certain techniques are very hard to distinguish between the usage of a attacker and the regular usage. I mean, there are techniques which states that the attacker is using the command line or is using PowerShell. And you will find that if you do the ranking and filtering, that those tends to be techniques that are very high on the list, but they are very difficult to detect. So the distinguishability is very hard. So you need probably extra tooling for user behavior analytics or stuff like that, and you might not have this. So you cannot implement this straight away. If you want to implement it, it will be of high complexity because you don't have like definable IOCs, or the number of expected false positives is quite high. So, and if you put this all together, then you could calculate your priority, and I stole this from software development, from SAFe actually. The idea, you would calculate the value you calculated, plus the time criticality, because you want to have this as well, so that you can react on real threats, and then divide this through complexity. And this is an adaptation of what's called WSJF in SAFe, which is weighted shortest job first. It's a methodology where you try to prioritize the feature, and you would like to figure out which one produces the most business value at the earliest time possible. And what we want to have is, we want to have the most value in sense of detection capability, improving our detections. That's the business value of our detections. And you want to have it as early as possible. And that's why you put in the complexity as well, and not just the value. because in this regard, use cases that are valuable but very complex to implement are maybe a bit less priority than many use cases with less value and high and also low complexity. So this will help you to do the prioritization of the use cases. And now you would probably say, well, but how do I calculate value? How do I value time criticality? And here again, when we look at WSJF, we don't need to have absolute values for this calculation. It's enough to have some relative values. So you look at several use cases and you look at which one is the least complex, and you assign a number 1 to that one. And then you grade the other one relative to that. And that's usually an exercise you should do with your security analysts together. And then you get this rating. And the same you do for value. You have all this information I showed you before, and you use this information then to have like a relative rating between those information, and then you come up with a priority which help you to implement use cases early, fast, and you improve your detection capabilities often as it should be. Well, and I think my time is up, so I skip and I go to the question.
Big round of applause, please, for Bruno.